speaking of this coming week and the story of Joseph, this fits perfectly with our series that we've been in as a church. If you're new with us today, we've been in a series called All Things. And the premise of this is a promise in Romans 8:28, where we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And as I was planning this series, something I did not tell you, I was planning this entire series with Summer Adventure Week in mind, with Joseph and his story. 3 or 4 weeks leading up to Summer Adventure Week, and then there's 3 or 4 after, sort of a saw sandwich, if you will. I don't know. The reason for this is because of all the characters in the Bible, few stand out as much as Joseph, as a man who experienced betrayal and disappointment and injustice, but also a man who had a perspective that God was working through all of it for good. And so at the end of his life, for example, sort of the punchline of Joseph's story is the way I think of it. He looks at his brothers, the primary culprits in his pain that he went through. He looks at his brothers, and he says in the last chapter of Genesis to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but what? But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." We're basically going to look at that this morning, the story of Joseph. Who are these lives that were saved? What was the harm that was intended to Joseph? And then ultimately, what is the good that God brought about through his suffering and his experience? So we're going to do a fast overview of his life, because I realized I take for granted being raised in the church like Joseph. Oh yeah, we all know Joseph. There's a lot of people who may be like, Joseph who, So I want to do a quick overview of his life and even point out how all along the way he was aware of God, was there and was working. And so we're going to do this overview and then focus on just 3 verses in the last chapter in this unique, surprising perspective that Joseph has toward those who hurt him. So, if you don't know Joseph, meet Joseph. The first time we meet him is in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. If you want to follow along and track, you can do that. But Genesis 37 is where we first meet Joseph as a 17-year-old young man with 11 brothers. How many of you have brothers? Okay, some brothers. How many of you have sisters? All right. All right. Nice little split there. Brothers and sisters, go. I don't know why I did that. But I have 2 brothers. And growing up with 2 brothers, it was a ton of energy. I have no clue what 11 brothers would have been like. But these guys live in a house with their father, and obviously they have mothers, but their father Jacob, who was renamed Israel, so you're going to see Israel, this is Jacob, their father, and he had some sheep. And his sons were looking after the sheep one day when Joseph's brothers were apparently misbehaving. And I don't know what they were doing, but in verse 2 of that chapter, it says that Joseph brought their father a bad report about them. Now, there's an adage about snitches and stitches and all that. We don't need that here, except to say that his brothers probably were not happy at all with him. And to make matters worse, verse 3 says their father loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Oh, boy. Because he had been born to him in his old age. I've been asked by my kids multiple times if who's my favorite. I'm like, all of you. There's no good answer there. But he tells us here that Joseph was obviously the father's favorite, which the boys knew, or at least came to know. By the end of verse 3, it says that their father made Joseph only an ornate robe, or as it's been called, the coat of many colors. And as a result of this, verse 4 naturally says his brothers, when they saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. And as bad as this seems, then we get to the dreams, where Joseph is hanging out with his brothers one day, and he says, "Guys, I have this dream. We were all together, and we were tying together these wheat sheaves, these sheaves of wheat, tying together a wheat, and my sheaf stood up, and all of your sheaves bowed down to mine." Okay, so go ahead and put yourself in the brother's shoes. How you feeling right now about Joseph? And then he has another dream where he describes that the sun and the moon and 11 stars all bowed down to him. And at this point, even his father is like, "Joseph, what are you saying? We're all going to bow to you?" So nobody's really able to stomach it right now. And it says that the brothers became really jealous of Joseph, obviously. But it does say that his father remembered the dreams. Remember the dreams. He locked it away. He's like, nah, there's something going on here. This wouldn't be an accident. And as bad as it is right now, you can imagine morale is probably pretty low between Joseph and his brothers. This is when it really starts to get bad, because his brothers are now looking for the opportunity to kill him. And we know this because one day Joseph's father sends Joseph to check on his brothers and bring a report back. How'd that go the first time? He brought a bad report, and it didn't go well for the brothers, but he says to do it again. So Joseph heads out to find his brothers, and he finds his brothers, and they see him coming, and what do? They start planning how to kill him. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to kill him. And Reuben, one of the brothers who has a conscience, is like, intercedes for Joseph and says, no, let's not kill him, guys. Let's throw him into this pit. By the way, the pit's over there, and we're going to throw him into the pit in the drama. But he's going into this pit. He's like, but let's not kill him. And so that's what they do. Joseph arrives. They rip that multicolored coat off of him, and they throw him into this pit. Reuben's plan on the side is he's going to sneak back and get Joseph out. He's going to rescue Joseph. But Reuben leaves, and before he can get back, his brothers take Joseph out and do what? They sell him to slave traders, to traders on their way to Egypt. They're like, what are we going to gain by killing our brother? Let's sell him for money. So they sell Joseph to traders who are on their way to Egypt. Reuben comes back, as you know, he's devastated, and they try to hatch this plan. How are we going to tell father? They decide to lie. So they take his coat, they cover it in animal blood, and they go back to the father and say, Dad, we don't know what happened. He's probably killed by an animal. So while their dad is mourning Joseph's loss, Joseph, meanwhile, is on his way to Egypt. Well, chapter 37, the end of 37, Joseph arrives in Egypt, and he is sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar is an officer. He's a captain of the guard for Pharaoh. And as bad as this was, he's now sold as a slave. There's a glimmer of hope in chapter 39 where it says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Even in the face of total betrayal, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord did not betray him. He stayed with Joseph, and he's successful, which is awesome, except Potiphar's wife noticed. And she had, and I'll just maybe say, dishonorable intentions for Joseph. And Joseph resisted her advances, and it was out of not pragmatism or convenience or didn't want to get caught. It's because he was respectful of his master and he loved God. How could I do such a thing? And so he resisted until she finally got sick of him resisting, and so she accused him of doing to her what she had been doing to him. And when Potiphar finds out, he is furious, and he's like, after all I've given you, you do this to my wife, and he throws Joseph in prison. For doing the right thing, he's thrown in prison. You ever been there, mistreated, misjudged, falsely accused? So he's in prison now, and even there, you think, okay, well, that's it. Joseph's done. But even there, look at this verse. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. When all the other people in his life had withdrawn from him, had taken away love, God said, I am still here. And he gave him favor, and the keeper of the prison said, I'm going to put you in charge. And one day in the prison, as the story continues, he meets two other men who were officers of Pharaoh. The cupbearer of Pharaoh and the chief baker are thrown into prison, okay? And they're there in prison, and one night they both have a dream. They wake up with their dreams, and they don't know the answer to their dreams, and they're confused and frustrated, so they turn to Joseph. Joseph, any ideas what these dreams mean? We won't go into the details of the dreams because we don't have time. But Joseph interprets their dreams for them, and then he very quickly gives credit to God. He says, do not interpretations belong to God? In other words, this isn't me, guys. Don't give me credit. God is here in prison, and he is going to work. He's going to do something. He's going to reveal these interpretations. Well, again, we won't go into the details of the dream except to say the cupbearer, Joseph tells the cupbearer, hey, you know what your dream means? In 3 days, you're going to be released and restored to your position. Cupbearer's like, woo. And the baker's like, what's mine? And he's like, in 3 days, you're going to be executed. And that is what happened. But before the cupbearer got out of prison, Joseph came to the cupbearer and he said this, please remember me. Hey, I did you a solid, right? Remember me. When it is well with you and you remember that I interpreted your dream, please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, to get me out of here. And then he tells him a little bit of his story. For I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing. that they should put me here? Well, after the cupbearer is released, he forgets about Joseph. He doesn't say anything to Pharaoh. He totally forgets about him. And then we read the next time we pick up, it says 2 years later, he's still in prison. 2 years later, he's still there. And one night, guess who else has a dream? Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream. And in Pharaoh's dream, he sees, if you want to close your eyes, he sees cows coming up out of the Nile River. And the first 7 cows are fat, healthy cows. And then 7 skinny cows come up out of the river. And then the skinny cows eat the fat cows, at which point it becomes a nightmare. You agreed? Carnivorous cows? No? Yeah. That'd be like I don't even know what that looks like, cows eating other cows. But the 7 skinny cows eat up the fat cows. And Pharaoh wakes up. He's like, well, what is going on? Then he has another dream. It's interesting, 2 dreams was the same pattern with Joseph, where God established what he was going to do. Anyway, second dream Pharaoh has, instead of cows, it's sheaves of, ears of grain, rather. Ears of grain, there's 7 healthy ones, followed by 7 unhealthy ones, and then the 7 unhealthy ones, like the first dream, swallow up the healthy ones. So Pharaoh wakes up. He's like, okay, there's something going on here. There's a repeated theme. I have no idea what it means. He's disturbed. He pulls together all of his wise men and magicians in the land and says, what does this mean? And they're like, I got nothing. And then there's this cupbearer, that old cupbearer, right? Hey, I know a guy once who, and I'm like, yeah, I bet you do, I was in prison, and I had a dream, and he told me, and it happened the way he said. And so Pharaoh's like, all right, so bring this guy to me. Joseph comes before Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph interprets the dream. Again, giving credit to God. He says, hey, by the way, God is the one who's revealing to you what's about to happen. This is not me. This is God working. So he tells them what this means. The 7 and the 7 is that there are 7 good years coming in the land. Everybody's going to be celebrating. It's going to be so awesome. And then it's going to be followed by 7 horrible years of famine that will be so bad that everyone will forget about the good years, which is what the whole swallowing up picture was. And Joseph makes known to him the meaning of this dream. And then he says, what I would recommend is you find a wise and a discerning person to oversee an effort to basically store up food in the good years, so that in the bad years you have something. And Pharaoh likes the idea, so Pharaoh is like, well, but where can we find a man like this? And it's picture like there's probably a fun little awkward silence while they're all like looking around, and they're kind of looking at Joseph like, hey, you're the guy who just interpreted the dream. What about you? As the story goes, Pharaoh instantly elevates him to a position of leadership, the highest in the land. He takes off his own signet ring and puts it on Joseph's hand. He dresses him in fine clothes, and he says anytime when Joseph is riding around in his chariot, you are all going to bow before Joseph. Talk about a change of destiny. And Joseph does what Pharaoh asked him to do, does it very well. He prepares for the 7 bad years, and then fast forward to the 7 bad years, and families are flocking to Egypt from all around to buy food because they have food to sell, because Joseph prepared them for that. And one of these families that comes for food is Joseph's family. His brothers, 10 brothers, roll into Egypt one day, and they bow before Joseph. But they don't know him. They don't recognize him at this point for whatever reason. At this moment, they're bowing before him. Chapter 42 says Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. Interesting. He's like, this is it. All the ridicule he faced for those dreams, he's like, it's happening. Well, since they don't recognize him, Joseph sort of plays with them. He puts them through some tests. And this part of the story, I'll be honest, has always sort of bothered me. I'm like, Joseph, you're kind of being a jerk. But I think the reason for these tests was Joseph was seeing if they'd changed, especially related to the way they treated their youngest brother. There's my theory, but let's look at this. The first test, very quickly, he accuses them of being spies in the land. They're like, we've come for food. He's like, no, you're spies. And they're like, no, we promise we're not spies. And they start telling them their story. We have a dad who lives in Canaan, and we also have a younger brother who stayed home with his dad, which, of course, Joseph perks up at that. He's like, you have a younger brother. Okay, so then the next step, Joseph says, to see if you're telling me the truth, I want you all to go home and bring me your younger brother. And, of course, they're like, oh, there's no way Dad's going to go with this. But he keeps one of the brothers, Simeon, there in Egypt. The rest of them go home, and when they ask their father, hey, can we have our younger brother to take back to Egypt? What do you think the father says? No. No. So they stay home. They basically eat through all their food, at which point the father says, you got to go back to Egypt, get more food. And they're like, hey, Dad, remember, we can't go back and get Simeon unless we have Benjamin, who is the youngest brother. And the father realizes there's no other way, so he lets Benjamin go, and they get back to Egypt. They bow before Joseph, and when Joseph sees Benjamin, it says he runs out of the room and weeps to see this brother. And he comes back, and it says he feeds him this amazing meal, and then he sends him home again. And this is an interesting part, where this time, the first time he sent them home, he filled their sacks with grain and he put their money back in their sacks. And they got home, they're like, oh, our money's here, what? And this time he puts the money back in their sacks after filling the grain, but then he slips in an expensive silver cup that Joseph owned into Benjamin's sack. And as soon as they leave, one of Joseph's men chases after them and stops them and accuses them of theft. Somebody took Joseph's cup, and the brothers are like, no way, there's no way. None of us would do that. And he says, in fact, they say, if you find that cup in any of our bags, you can kill that kid. And the rest of us will be your slaves. And of course, they're going through the sacks, and they find it in Benjamin's sack. And it's at this point that Judah, the one who is responsible for the plan to get rid of Joseph, Judah pulls Joseph aside, still not knowing who he is, and basically pours his heart out. He tells in the story of how they have their father who lost a son. And he's like, if dad loses another son, it'll be the death of him. He's not going to make it. Take me, keep me. And at this point, this is where Joseph breaks. And he reveals his identity. And he says, guys, it's me. I'm your brother. And after the shock of the moment, he says to his brothers, go back, get your families, bring your kids, bring everyone here. I'm going to take care of you here. And when Pharaoh finds out Joseph has a family, Pharaoh's like, I'm going to give you guys the best of the land. And this is where you could say, and they lived happily ever after. Until Exodus, when the Israelites grow and they become slaves in Egypt for 400 years. But for now, let's just stay here at the end of Genesis, where they are sort of living happily ever after, except his brothers are skeptical. We just ruined our brother's life, and they're doing the math. And then he says, it's okay, it's all good. Hey, by the way, bring your families back here. I'll take care of you. And they're like, no, something's not right. And this is where I would love to have you join me in the last chapter of Genesis with just the little time we have left and pick up with their skepticism of Joseph's response to them, but specifically look at Joseph's surprising response to his brothers. Genesis chapter 50. Their father has just died, by the way. Jacob/Israel has just died. And so they travel home to be at his funeral. And verse 14 is where we'll start. It says, after burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury their father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, hey, your father left these instructions before he died, saying, this is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. They realized they have no cards to play. They are 100% at his mercy. But look at the next 3 verses, which is where we'll focus our time. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Isn't it interesting? This man who you would expect and would have every right to be bitter and to be vengeful is kind and is forgiving. And the question I want to address or ask is how? How can Joseph genuinely say these things to his brothers? And these 3 verses, I think, have 3 answers to that question related to Joseph. Verse 19, look at that one more time with me. He says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of God? Let me ask you this. Did Joseph have the power and the position to punish his brothers? Yes, power and position. Yes, he had the power and the position. Did he have, humanly speaking, the right and the reason to punish his brothers? Yes. But Joseph understood that he's not God, very simply. And what he reveals here is that he trusts God to be God. If you're taking notes, there's going to be 3 observations here that enable and empower this response in Joseph. Number 1, he trusts God to be God. Instead of taking control of the situation, instead of trying to get back at the people who hurt him, and by the way, when we're in those moments, there is the illusion of power over the other person. Right? Somebody hurts you and you're mad at them and you're not forgetting and you've got it written down mentally and and if I ever have the opportunity, and you're keeping track. And we think we have power over them. In fact, we're only enslaving ourselves to bitterness. It's not hurting them, it's hurting us. But he has somehow moved past this point. He says, don't be afraid. Why? Because I'm not. I'm not afraid, I'm not bitter, I'm not angry. Why? Because I trust God and I know that it's not my place to execute the kind of judgment that you're fearing. It's not my place. He trusts God to be God. Now, in this moment, in the sort of the justice narrative, somebody may think, oh, cool, so his brothers get off scot-free. They get off the hook. They don't have to deal with it. But then I realized, what is worse, to have to answer to your brother or to answer to God? Now, temporarily, you may say, well, the brother, because that's like the immediate consequence. But ultimately, man, Joseph cared less about getting back at his brothers than he did about how his brothers stood with God. Why? Because sin is ultimately against God. And this is what we see in the Bible. David was a man who understood this. He was the king. He had all the power in the land. He could kind of do whatever he wanted. And he took another man's wife, Bathsheba. And to cover up his decision, he had her husband killed, Uriah. And when he finally came to his senses, he was confronted with his sin by a prophet. And he turned to God and said this, against you and you only have I sinned. That is a profound theological statement. After all of the wreckage that had been caused by David's bad decisions, he didn't say, and Bathsheba and Uriah and the community and Israel, he's like, you are the only one that I have ultimately sinned against. And done what is evil in your sight, so you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. See, this is the moment that Joseph wants his brothers to reach. And sometimes we circumvent people's rightness with God in our desire to control and manipulate and pay back. And Joseph releases them to God, and he's like, I want you to be right with God. He's the one that you've offended in all of your planning and your plotting. So he releases judgment to God. Listen to this. He releases judgment to God and in the process is released from bitterness. I'm going to say that again. Joseph releases judgment to God and in the process is released from bitterness. Romans 12 tells us this is what we are to do. Paul writes, do not repay anyone evil for evil. That's what he sure could have done, and it would have been well understood why he would do that. But he says, be careful to do what's right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. That's what Joseph's doing. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. See, we trust that God knows better than we do what's right. And this response to evil is summarized really well in verse 21 of Romans 12 that says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. See, vengeance is responding to evil with evil. It's being overcome by evil. It's griping about someone else's wrong and then becoming a participator in the very same thing. And he's saying, no, don't fall into that trap. Overcome evil with good. That's what he's doing here. He's trusting God to be God. The second thing that we see is verse 20, this surprising response. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, for the saving of many lives. I love this. So not only does Joseph trust God to be God, but he trusts God's plan. And what this means practically is, yes, he trusts God to deal with the hurt, but that's not all he does. Like, okay, God, I can't stand my brothers. They've hurt me. But I trust that you're going to punish them. That's not quite enough for a healthy heart. The second thing is he knew that even though God can deal with the hurt, God was also working good the whole time through the hurt. He's like, guys, don't be afraid. I have a God that's bigger than you, right? This God who has good plans, and he says to the brothers, this is significant. He says, you intended to harm me. Some translations say, you meant evil. We already looked at how Joseph is extending grace to his brothers. At Mac, we talk about embracing and extending the life-changing what? Grace and, go ahead, truth of Jesus. You can't have one without the other. Jesus was full of grace and truth. He told people the truth, but he did it in a way that they knew they were loved. Joseph does the same thing. He doesn't say, it's okay. He didn't do anything wrong. No, he says, you intended evil for me. You hurt me. You harmed me. You know, when it comes to forgiveness, sometimes we think forgiveness is saying it's okay. It's not okay. It's not okay when someone mistreats you or betrays you or when someone abandons you. It's not okay when you have to pay the consequences for someone else's decision. It's not okay. And that's not what forgiveness is. Yes, Joseph has forgiven them. Yes, he's released vengeance to God, but this doesn't mean he pretends it didn't happen. He states the truth about it. He faces the facts, but forgiveness then releases those facts to God. You see that? Forgiveness faces the facts. This is what it is. You really hurt me. But then it hands those facts over to God. I'm going to let God deal with what that means. And so he says, you intended to harm me. But guys, listen, all along, God intended it for good. No, same word. I think that's fascinating. The same word to describe what his brothers were doing and what God was doing, just different aims and different goals. The word intend is the Hebrew word chashab, literally means to weave together a fabric. You were putting together this sort of evil tapestry for my life. You were plotting and planning, and it was bad. It was harmful. But at the same time, God was weaving together this good tapestry. I think of Proverbs 16, verse 9, that says, man makes his plans, but what? The Lord directs his steps. God is moving in all of it, even in our evil plots. God is like, I am going to cause all things to work for good. And so I almost think of this as two sides of the same tapestry. They're weaving, they're intending, right? Chashab. I found this picture of a tapestry this week. It's beautiful, beautiful tapestry, isn't it? No, you can say no. I don't find that beautiful. I guess it's in the eye of the beholder, but I don't think that's beautiful, but this is the backside of the tapestry. If you flip it over, there's the front. That's what the front of it looks like. Same tapestry, different perspective, right? And if you can only see one side, you'd say, well, that's garbage. Well, that's hurtful, that's harmful, that's evil, that's confusing. God's not working, right? Here they are side by side. You can see the contrast. Isn't that how life looks a lot of times on the left, where you're just like, there's no redemption going on right now. But God's on the other side saying, no, I'm putting together something beautiful. We're weaving, but he's also weaving. Yeah? The promise of Romans 8:28, we know that in all things, how many things? All things God is working. God is working every single stitch, every pull of the thread. God is working for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. In our failures, in the hurts we experience, even when it doesn't look that way. Now, I think it's fascinating. Joseph didn't have the text of Romans 8:28, but he understood the truth. And I was convicted many times, I have the text. How often do I not live out or apply the truth of it? Joseph had this perspective throughout his life, which is why all the way back when he first revealed his identity to his brothers, this is 5 chapters before the end of the book. Here's what he said to his brothers: do not be distressed or angry. There he is calming them down again. With yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. You see the two sides of the same tapestry? You sold me, but God sent me. And I love the contrast of emotions here. He says, don't be distressed or angry or afraid. By the way, do you know what those are fruits of? There's a lot of answers, but in my mind, that's fruits of a desire to control. It's not believing that God is God. It's trying to manipulate circumstances. It's the opposite of releasing to God and trusting in God. Their whole lives, these boys had been taking matters into their own hands, trying to manipulate circumstances to their own benefit. And when you do that, you're constantly afraid things are going to fall apart. And so he's constantly telling them, you're distressed, I can tell. You're angry, you're afraid. It's just fruits of the way that they had lived their lives. And Joseph's on the other end of the spectrum saying, hey, you don't have to be, I'm not. Why? Because, yeah, you sold me. That's true. That was evil. But God sent me. You sold me, God sent me. And I know that we're not Joseph, so maybe you plug your own words in there and have your own two-sided tapestry. You hurt me, God helped me. Maybe you would say, you abused me, but God adopted me as his own child. Maybe you could say, you walked out on me, God moved in. You brought hurt, God brought hope. You see, the whole time the brothers were weaving their fabric, God was weaving his. This past week I was mowing the lawn with our youngest son, who's 6 years old. And he sees his older brother out there mowing the lawn, because we're kind of at that phase now, which is kind of fun most of the time. And he sees his brother doing it, and he's like, I'm ready. I can do this, Dad. Where's the key? And I'm like, buddy, let's work on this together. And so he's sitting on my lap, 6 years old. He really wants to mow the lawn. And so I want to let him do his thing, but I also want to get the lawn mowed. Does that make sense? I have a purpose, and it's a good purpose. I'd like it to look decent at the end, and it's done. But I also want to let him go for it. And so I was thinking about how God approaches us, and he says, go for it, Live life, have fun, make mistakes, but I also have purposes for your life, and I've got boundaries built into this. And so after a little bit of whiplash, really, because it was intense, I was like, oh, okie doke. And I just kind of reached my hands under his arms and was doing this, right? Okay, watch the line. Oh, there we go. And his hands are on the wheel, and he's happy, and I'm kind of doing this, right? So if you were to ask him, by the way, the lawn got mowed. We don't just have a bunch of crop circles. But if you were to ask my son, did you mow the lawn, what would he say? Yeah, I mowed the lawn. But I was kind of the one steering. I knew what the plan was, and I helped him in that. One of the best pictures of this two-sided tapestry that the brothers sold him, but God sent him, is Jesus. Jesus himself, who endured such rejection and injustice. And Peter, after the resurrection, he is talking to the very people who killed Jesus, preaching. And here's what he says to them. He says, this man, Jesus, was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. So, who put Jesus to death? These men. He says it. You killed Jesus. You are responsible for your actions before God. But whose plan was it? God's. The deliberate plan and foreknowledge of God. Now, I don't know how all those things interact. One day we will. God is the one who planned for Jesus to be mistreated and executed for the salvation of many lives, just like Joseph. And that's the last aspect of Joseph's perspective I'm going to look at, is that this act in Jesus' life that we could say was the greatest act of hate and injustice was also the greatest demonstration of love we've ever known. Two sides of the same event. And in Joseph's life, at the end, verse 21 now, this is the last one, and then we'll close. He says, so then, don't be afraid. Again, he's reassuring his brothers because he's released them to God. Don't be afraid of me. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. It's the opposite of what they expected. It's the opposite of what they deserved. What do you call that in the Bible? Grace. He's not only forgiving them. Joseph could have said, I'm Joseph, your brother. And they're like, oh no. And he's like, yeah, you're right. You better be scared. And I'm going to have you live in a land, but you watch yourself. You're forgiven officially. No. He's like, you have nothing to be afraid of. In fact, not only am I forgiving you of everything that you've done, I'm going to lavish upon you and your families and your children, he says. It almost sounds like a covenantal promise of sorts. I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to keep taking care of you, and I'm even going to take care of your children who had nothing to do with your sin. I think this is why theologians often refer to Joseph as a type of Christ. A picture of Jesus, a foreshadowing because of all of the injustice he faced, and yet by the end he was loving the people who caused it. Because he understood that all along the way, in all of the pain and the hurt and the injustice and being in prison, even though he didn't deserve to be there, he knew God is working his good purposes. And I get to be a part of it. So I don't know where you are this morning, but this last one that I wanted to highlight is Joseph not only trusted God to be God, he trusted his plan, but he abided in God's love. He chose love. These first two enabled him to do the last. He loved them in a way they did not deserve. And so wherever you are this morning, or maybe something's popped up as I'm talking, maybe resentment is real for you today. Maybe you have anger. Maybe you have bitterness, and maybe it's at God, honestly. And I want to just tell you today, based on what I see in God's word, he wants to set you free. Do you believe that? He wants to set you free. Now, you may be thinking, well, does that mean I have to say that it's okay what happened? No, that's not forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't saying, well, I'm going to forget about it. Forgive and forget's not a thing, okay? Forgiveness is saying, no, that happened, it hurt, it shouldn't have happened, it was wrong, but I'm going to release that to God. I'm going to trust God with it. And that's what you have the opportunity to do today. Whatever that is, you're going to say, God, I don't want to carry around bitterness with the illusion that I'm holding power over this person. In fact, I'm only enslaving myself. I want to be free. So wherever you are today, I just want you to have that opportunity. Not just to release them, but to pray for them. Pray for your enemies. Bless those who have persecuted you, have hurt you. Because I think of Joseph, I don't think he would go back and undo what happened to him knowing what God accomplished through it all. Because Joseph would not have survived if he had not gone through what he did. And this, of course, again, leads us to Jesus. This was not just some series of unfortunate events. It was God's plan all along. And Jesus said, whoever tries to save his life, to cling to his comforts or whatever, will lose it. But whoever loses his life, whoever says, God, I trust you, with the events, with the sequence, will save his life, which is literally what happened for Joseph. Whoever relinquishes control and puts their trust in God will be saved. And so this isn't just a Joseph story. We hear this and go, oh yeah, no, I know Joseph. It's not a Joseph, it's a you story. It's a me story. What are we going to do with the things that we feel like we have to grip onto and control? I want to invite our worship team forward and just encourage us. I'm going to read a quote as we end. Whatever is distressing you today, whether it's anger or bitterness, I want to encourage you to release those things to God. And that as you release them, you yourself will be released from the things that have been holding you captive. There's a quote by a man named David Guzik. He's a pastor, a Bible commentator, a teacher. I love his stuff. And there's this quote where he pulls together the picture of this tapestry that God was weaving in the life of Joseph, but not stopping at Joseph, because we could stop at Joseph, which lots of times we do in Bible stories, and we're like, cool, good for Joseph. He carries it all the way to Jesus and shows, because Jesus was born in the tribe of Judah, who was one of Joseph's brothers, who would not have survived if it weren't for what Joseph went through. So let me just tie this together, and this is from David Guzik, this quote, where he sort of shows the stitches of this fabric that God was putting together. Listen, if Joseph's brothers never sold him to traders, then Joseph never went to Egypt. If Joseph never went to Egypt, he was never sold to Potiphar. If he was never sold to Potiphar, Potiphar's wife never falsely accused him. If his wife never falsely accused him, then he was never put in prison. If he was never put in prison, he never met the baker and the cupbearer. If he never met the baker and the cupbearer, he never interpreted their dreams. And if he never interpreted their dreams, he never got to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And if he never got to interpret Pharaoh's dream, he never was elevated to the position of leadership. And if he was never elevated to leadership, he never wisely administered for the severe famine that came upon the land. And if he never wisely administered for the famine, then his family back in Canaan would have perished. And if his family perished from the famine, then the Messiah could not come forth from a dead family. And if the Messiah could not come forth, then Jesus never came. And if Jesus never came, then we're all dead in our sins and without hope in the world. What a cool story, right? And it's not just about Joseph getting thrown in prison and go, oh man, that's a bummer. Make it stop, God. God's like, no, I have such higher purposes than yours, such marvelous purposes that when you get to read the story from the end, and we don't have the luxury of doing this in our own lives, unfortunately. And that's why, right? We're in the middle of it. But when we get to the end, we're going to look back and say, oh, praise God. Thank you, God, for your marvelous good plan that you allowed us to go through pain and difficulty for the ultimate good, which is the saving of many lives. Would you close your eyes with me, bow your heads? I just want to provide an opportunity for response and just put out this one question. Where do you need to trust God? Where do you need to trust God? You know, we've been talking about how God works all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Maybe you're like, boy, I don't know if I'm in that group. If you don't know, the best way to know, if you are, is respond to him. It's that simple. Say, God, I want to turn to you. I want to be in that group of people that is called according to your purpose, for whom you are working all things for good. And so maybe the trust step that you need to take today isn't an issue or a particular situation, which some of you, that may be it. It's maybe your life. You've never taken the step toward God, and what I would urge you to do today is take that step. Move toward God and say, I relinquish control. I know that I'm a sinner, and I know, Jesus, that you died on the cross for my sins so that I could be forgiven and saved and have your grace lavished upon me. If you want that today, it is free of charge to you. You receive it by faith and putting your trust in him. But I want you to just take a moment, take a minute or so to respond to Jesus wherever you are, whatever that area that you feel like you need to grip onto, and just open up your heart, open up your hands, and relinquish control to him. And then we'll respond in worship.